Like I do every week, I want to talk about what you guys just sang. You know, that's one of my favorite songs. I mean, it truly is. I mean, it's an old song, but it's a good song. And there's so much truth and power in the words that we just sang. Usually when we sing that song, I ask you guys the question of, is it really true what you just declared to God? That when you worship, you're declaring God the words that you're singing. That's why the words matter. And so the idea that your heart will only sing to God, is that truly who you are tonight? I mean, I'm going to go ahead and start with kind of a hard question right off the bat. When you walked into here tonight, was your heart solely focused on God? I mean, or was your heart somewhere else? Was it in another place, focused on another thing? Maybe you're having a tough week. I know I talked to some of you in here tonight before the service started, and it's been a long week. It's been a rough week. And so maybe you came in here tonight and your heart was just not fixated on God. And so you feel like you didn't really connect in that moment. Now, on the other hand, there were some of you, as I watched and you worshiped, that you were right there. I mean, you could tell that you were in the presence of God. And one of my favorite parts of that song talks about how we're running to His arms. And I love that part for two reasons, because there's 2 points to that. The first point is this, is that God's arms are open to you. That when it says you're running to His arms, obviously you're not running to closed arms, you're running to arms that are open. And so when we run to God, know that His arms are open to you. But the second part that I love so much is that it's an active response on our end. That the idea of running to God means that we're chasing to Him. We're going to Him. We're passionately seeking God. And so some of you in here tonight, as I watched and you worshiped, you were running to God. And that's where I want to challenge all of us to be. I mean, there's no better place to be in the world than to run to God with His arms open wide. I'm going to pray. I'm super excited about tonight. I was pumped last week. If you missed last week, you missed the special collide. We did our first ever family night. Let me just say, I don't know if I told some of you afterwards. I was super proud of you guys. I really was. Based on the fact that you guys feel, I guess, proud enough, happy enough, whatever the adjective is, to invite your parents to come to Collide. You care enough about Collide that you want to invite them to come, because we were all kind of we had a leadership meeting earlier, and our leadership, we were all kind of just blown away by how many parents showed up last week. So thank you for what you guys did last week. But the cool part to me on this idea of worship was that you guys worshiped with your parents in the room. I mean, you didn't stop doing what you had been doing for the last 3, 4, 5 weeks. I mean, you worshiped whether your parents were standing next to you or not. So that's really cool. So let me pray, and then we're going to look at some pretty cool stuff tonight. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for tonight. And Lord, truly, one of my favorite parts during our Collide service is just to be able to be still. For some of us right now in this moment, this is the first time all day long, maybe all week long, that we've been able to just relax and breathe. Just to be able to rest, to be able to just sit away from the distractions that are outside those doors, and truly just to be in your presence, God. Lord, as we sang to you that we are running to your arms, that our hearts would only sing to you, that you would be the only thing that matters in our life. Lord, there's so much peace and love and encouragement and joy that come from that. Father, what some of us need to realize in this moment is that we're trying to overcome all the hardships of life, the difficulties we face on our own. But the way to get through those is if we just stop and run to you. Lord, I thank you for how much you love us. I thank you that you're a God whose arms are open wide. I thank you that you love us so much. Lord, I ask that you be with us in this time. Lord, I ask that you speak through me directly to the hearts, kind of like Caleb prayed a second ago. That you would pierce the hearts of these students. Father, we talked about it last week, but these students are growing. I mean, they truly are seeking you. Nobody forced them to come here tonight. They came because they want to be in your presence, and they want to grow in their faith. And so, Father, I ask that you just pierce the hearts tonight. Let our lives be changed. Let us know you more. Father, we love you, but most importantly, you love us. In your name I pray. Amen. And so if you've been with us, if this is your first time to Collide, let me welcome you. My name's Alex Gentili. I'm the guy who kind of gets to lead the ship here at Collide, no pun intended, with the ship. Y'all didn't get that. Wreck ship. But I get the kind of opportunity to lead this group. And so we've been in this series for now. This is week 4 of this series called Going Old School. What that means is basically it's a sermon series through the Old Testament. We picked the Old Testament because my thought was that we could help grow in our knowledge of the Old Testament. If you're an Old Testament whiz tonight, cool. You're in the minority if you know the Old Testament like that. The rest of us, including myself, we've been on this journey of learning it a little bit more. And so last week, I'm not going to give you all 4 weeks of what we've been talking about. But last week specifically, to connect you with tonight, because you're going to see some of the same things that we talked about last week. But last week, we basically read the entire book of Job. We made it through all 42 chapters in the 30 minutes that we had together. And basically, we looked at his life and how ultimately there's 2 things we saw last week. The first was this, that God is in control. That one of the main premises that people don't think about with the story of Job is that God gave Satan the permission to put Job through the suffering he went through. I mean, it was God who was in control the entire time. God never was out of control. God was never tricked. God was in control from the moment that it started in chapter 1 to the moment it ended in chapter 42. And some of you needed to hear that because some of you probably are going through the same stuff you went through last week, but some of you are facing hardships and adversities and struggles, and you need to know that God is in control. He's not forgotten you. He hasn't left you. He's in control of it all. But the second point we looked at, this was the main point for last week, is that Job went through all this suffering, lost his kids, lost his family, lost his property, his animals, all his stuff. We talked about how he was the greatest man of the East and he became the least man. And in a moment of an afternoon, in 5 minutes of all these people telling him all this stuff was taken away. And so we saw that in a time of suffering, that for 42 chapters, Job never turned his back on his faith. That Job continuously sought God, running to his arms, running to God, and basically his faith stayed strong the whole time. And so tonight, I want to continue that same thought because we're looking at a new character tonight. We're going to flash forward in the Old Testament because I just felt like it's where we wanted to go. And so instead of going kind of in order, we're going to jump like 5 or 6 books of the Bible. We're going to go to Daniel. Daniel is one of these guys that I just like. I'm a Daniel fan. If you don't know anything about Daniel, you're going to learn tonight some about who Daniel was. But Daniel, kind of like Job, was a man known for his faith. I mean, he was a guy, and we're going to look more about that just trusted God. That was a servant of God, that followed after God. He was a believer in God, and you're going to see his faith on display here in a second. But I once again want to ask you the same question I did last week, is that if you're a believer in Jesus Christ tonight, which I think as I look across the room, the majority of you are you displaying an act of faith that people would identify you as a person of God? I mean, once again, Daniel, as we're going to read in a second, is going to be known as a guy who is living for God. Same thing with Job. Job was known as a guy who was living for God. And so my question to you is, are you known as a guy or a woman who's living for God? Because ultimately, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, that's all that matters. That if you've accepted Jesus, the only definition of your life that you need is I'm a believer of God, period. You don't need anything else. It's not I'm a believer of God and I'm good at sports. I'm a believer in God and I'm pretty. I'm a believer in God and I'm talented or I'm smart or I'm gifted. No. You just need God, period. It's enough. That's all you need. God is enough. Remember, this whole idea of this entire series is God is the great I am. He is who He is. He's always been. He is who He says He is. So that's the premise we've been looking at. And so when we get to Daniel, I want you to turn to Daniel chapter 6. Because just like last week where we read the entire book of Job, we're going to look at the entire chapter of chapter 6. So I'm not going to tell you a bunch of funny stories up front because we don't have time. Because I want to get you through, and I'm really not that funny anyway. But I want to get you guys through this because I think this will really hit home with some of you. So let me go ahead and kind of paint the picture of kind of what's going on just so you have an idea here. So right now, kind of like I said, we flash forward several chapters into the Old Testament. So there's been a lot of stuff that's occurred. So instead of me making a cool timeline like I've done for some of these other sermons, I'm just going to jump to the case. We don't have time to go through 7 slides of timeline stuff. So just some main things that have occurred here. So Babylon is now the major city. They have overthrown Jerusalem. They've overthrown Judea. Babylon is the city. That's the major city that's going on. Jerusalem was invaded. I wrote it down somewhere in 586 BC. So Jerusalem was overthrown. Daniel and some of his friends at the time were living in Jerusalem, so they have been exiled and kicked out of their place because Babylon has come in and has taken over. And so the reason I'm telling you that is that's one of the main points of the entire book. So I'm going to challenge you this week, go read Daniel. But that's one of the entire points of Daniel's writing, is that he's writing to his people, to the Jewish people, trying to convince them that God is sovereign. Even though it doesn't look like it right now, even though we've been kicked out of our hometown, basically, I have a note here that talks about that Jerusalem's going to get completely wiped out, like it wasn't like they took over. They're going to wipe it out. That happens later. We're not going to get into that. So basically, Daniel's got this opportunity, or this challenge, probably is the better word, to convince the Jewish people, his followers, that God is still sovereign. Even though your home's destroyed, even though you've lost everything, even though we're exiled, like some of us have been through this hurricane, some of you have lost everything, Daniel's trying to convince these people that God is still sovereign. So that's one of the main points of this book. And so really, when we get to chapter 6, what's kind of happened is King Nebuchadnezzar, y'all won't heard him if you grew up in church, has conquered Judea and Jerusalem. Daniel and his friends have been exiled to under the king's rule. So now Daniel kind of works for the king, works for King Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel, once again, and we're going to look at this really in verse 1 here, because of Daniel's faith, he found favor in the king's eyes. So Daniel's not just some dude on the outside of the kingdom. He is like one of King Nebuchadnezzar's dudes. Like he's going to be put in a class all by himself. So that needs to be important. So one of the points of that is Daniel, if you look through the first 3 or 4 chapters, stay with me, don't fall asleep. Thank you, Nate. Perk up. Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar have this relationship where King Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams, and Daniel basically is going to interpret them. He's going to basically tell them what they mean. So that's part of the relationship that's building here. And so then Daniel was promoted in the kingdom. He goes ranks farther up. And so then this dude named Darius arrives on the scene. And this is where we're about to get to the scriptures. And so Darius is this guy who just kind of shows up. He takes over a position of another guy that we don't have time to talk about tonight. But basically, Darius has now been put in charge of part of the kingdom. And so now Daniel is going to kind of follow under his leadership. So you have King Nebuchadnezzar, then you're going to have King Darius, and now you got Daniel who's under Darius. So that's important for us tonight. So here we go, chapter 6, verse 1, all the way through. I'm going to stop as we go, kind of like I've been doing. So here we go. It pleased Darius, once again, this is now the king who's in charge over everything of this city. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps. So pause just so if you don't know what that word is, if you're not familiar with what a satrap is. Basically, these are chief representation, or chief represents. Is that the right word? Sweetie, is that right? Chief representatives. Thank you. That's why you marry gentlemen. Basically, these are kind of overseers of the king. They work for the king. So the king now has 120 of these people who now work for him, who basically go around the kingdom, kind of look around things, just kind of give oversight work for the king. So that's what a satrap is. So it says, it's pleased to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, workers for the king, or short term, to be throughout the whole kingdom. And over them, 3 high officials. So you have 120 guys, and 3 of them are their bosses. So just think about it that way. You have 120 employees, 3 bosses, then the king. That's the hierarchy there. It says, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. And so that's key to note because Daniel ranks right under the king. He's one of the 3 guys. Okay, so once again, I'm kind of giving you context. Stay with me. We're going to get into some exciting stuff here in a second. So Daniel was one of them, to whom the satrap should give an account so that the king might suffer no loss. Verse 3, then Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and the satraps because of an excellent spirit that was in him. Now here's where we begin to start to see the picture of Daniel's faith in God. This verse in verse 3 says that Daniel became distinguished above the other officials, meaning not only was he just one of the 3, he was the guy. He was the guy that King Darius trusted with everything. He was the one giving oversight of all these people not because he was talented, not because he was smart, not because he was pretty, not because he was 6'4" and just yoked and was in the gym. It's because he had an excellent spirit. Now I want that to begin to set in because Daniel is going to begin to find favor amongst the king because of his relationship with God. See, here's one of the points I want to make to you. You're going to see this throughout the text, but I want to go ahead and make this point so you can begin to think about it. You don't get promoted in work, promoted in life, promoted in sports, promoted in all these things because of your ability. That might be part of it, but it's because, as believers in Jesus Christ specifically, you have an excellent spirit within you. See, once again, God's in control of all this stuff. You know, all these elected officials that we just had this week, if you didn't know, there was local officials that ran for office, and some of them were elected. What the Bible says is that those guys got put in those positions because of God's authority. Not because they were talented, not because they're the best at the job, it's because God wanted them there. And so we need to begin to have this mindset that when we find privilege, when we get job opportunities or good things happen in our job, it's because we have found favor in God's eyes. God is giving us blessings because of the Spirit that's within us. So you need to understand that Daniel was not promoted to be high official because he was good looking or good at his job. It's because there was an excellent spirit that shone throughout him. That when Daniel did life, people knew he was a follower of Christ. So once again, I go back to the first question. When people look at you, do they see Jesus? If I was to look at your life, I never met you, but we bumped into each other on the street, would I know that you're a believer in Jesus Christ? Would you know that I was a believer in Jesus Christ? Because we need to let the Spirit of God show through us. And so it says back in verse 3, then Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because of an excellent spirit that was in him. That's it. That's the only reason. There's a period. We're going to jump to a new sentence. That's it. Daniel was found favored because of the Spirit in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel was going to have rule over the whole kingdom because of the Spirit of God that was in him. Verse 4. But here's where we're about to see the story change. Then the high officials, meaning the other guys, the other two leaders, and the satraps, sought to find ground for complaints against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. And so what we see is that God gives us favor when we serve him. That when we are a man of faith or a woman of faith. But there's also some worldly consequences for that. Is that when we live for God, the world is going to turn its back on you. When you live for God and make him the priority in your life, there are going to be some things that you have to face because you've chosen God. That just because you are a Christian, it does not mean that your life is now easy. Just because Daniel had an excellent spirit living in him, it did not mean that his life was about to be roses. Daniel was about to go through, and we're going to look at the story as I'm going to continue, of some really hard stuff. But notice that these other people, that his co-workers, the other guys that were under him, are looking to find problem with him because they're jealous of the man that he is. And so that's a point that I want to make to you, because I think, and I'm going to kind of segue over here just for a second. So many of us are afraid to live for Jesus, and I want you to focus here. So many of us are afraid to live for Jesus because we're afraid of what other people are going to say about us. There's so many of us who did not live for Christ in high school, or didn't go to the party, or didn't date that person, or didn't do that drug, or didn't have that drink, or didn't have sex with that person because they were afraid of what everybody else was going to say about them, instead of caring about what he says about them. See, Daniel never loses his faith in this whole moment. You're going to see it throughout the story. But these other guys were jealous because of the favor Daniel was finding because he was a man of God. And so just so to burst some of your bubbles, there's going to be people in your life who are not going to like you because you're a Christian. There are going to be people in your life who are jealous of you because you're a Christian. There are going to be people in your life who talk about you because you're a Christian. There are going to be people in your life who choose not to be your friends because you're a Christian. But what I want you to see, and you're going to see it throughout the story, is being a Christian is so much worth, or so much better than having those things. Having Jesus and God in your life is so much better than going to that party or having that friend or being in that relationship. Because God's the one who's in control. God's the one who never turns his back on you. God's the one who loves you. And so we see that these guys want to find a problem for Daniel. It says, back to verse 4, it says, they could not find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. and no error or fault was found in him. Basically, Daniel was a guy who had no errors in his life because he lived for God. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground or complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in his connection with the law of his God. So notice, think about Daniel as a believer here for a second. The only fault that they can find in Daniel is that he's a sold-out believer for Christ. Period. That's it. That's the only fault that this guy's got, is that he loves Jesus so much. Think about how your life would be if that was you. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm that guy. You can find a lot of fault in me. Once again, probably ask my wife. She can tell you some stories of where I fall short. Ask my parents. My parents usually show up. They're not here tonight, so that'll be good. But my point is this, is that Daniel is this guy. I'm trying to paint a picture for you of who Daniel is. The only fault that these satraps and officials can find is that Daniel loved God so much. Period. That's it. That's all they had on him. And so what they're about to do, and you're going to see it, is they're going to make this obscene law that says Daniel can't be a Christian so that they can find fault with him. They're about to create a law, or have the King Darius create this law just so that they can find a complaint with Daniel. Imagine if that was you. Imagine if people had to say, well, we got to make something up so Nate will fall because he's so sold out for Jesus. Or we got to create this whole new list of rules that we have to follow just so Garrett won't be a strong believer. Like, think about this guy for a second. And so then these high officials and satraps, who were about to take the story, came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps and the counselors, all the employees of the king, and the governors are agreed that the king, here comes the new rule, should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any other god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Basically meaning be put to death. And so this new rule is that for 30 days, the only person that you can worship is King Darius. That's going to be the new rule, meaning Daniel, you can't worship your God, you can't worship any other god besides King Darius. And everybody in the kingdom is about to have to follow this rule. Once again, the rule is just established so that they can find fault with the man who had the fault. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, notice the highlighted part here, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber that opened toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before God as he had done previously. Now here's where the sermon takes part, because I'm going to spend a lot of our time here in this moment. Once again, continuing with kind of the context, a rule has just been made that you cannot worship God, period. The only God for the next 30 days that you can worship is Darius. And Daniel gets word of this. Once again, a man whose life is devoted to his faith. And so now Daniel's got this choice, like some of us have, or all of us have, where he's either going to choose to continue to worship his God, or he's going to choose to give into the pressures of the world, or choose to give into the pressures of his friendships, or his co-workers. And so Daniel has 2 options. But I want you to notice what it says. It says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, meaning as soon as Daniel heard that the new law had been put in place, Daniel made the decision like that. It says he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times and he did what? He prayed. Daniel did not let a new law change what he was going to do. That last part says, as he had done previously. Meaning Daniel stuck to his routine. He stuck to his faith. Now, I'm a guy who believes that everything in the scriptures are there for a reason. That there are not just random sentences in the scripture just to add extra part of the story. So I want to point to one part in the scriptures that I skipped over the first time until I went back. Notice it says he went to his house where he had windows. Why are we talking about windows? Why is it important that this phrase windows is put in there? It says he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. Once again, imagine for a second why this sentence is in here. And here's my belief. I don't know if this is right, I don't know if this is wrong, but I believe this is what it's there for. Because I believe there's a point here. This whole entire story, because we're going to see, I'll give you the end. Daniel's about to be thrown into the lion's den for worshiping God. We're about to read that. This all could have been changed if he would have closed the windows. the entire story would have been over. Nobody would have known that Daniel went to his house to pray if he would have just shut the windows. But instead, Daniel goes to his house, and he opens, or he keeps his windows open. I don't know if they were opened or closed. I don't know. It didn't say that, so I'm not going to make it up. Because once again, I believe the word is true. I don't need to make it up. So he either opens the windows or he keeps them open. He goes to the windows where he can be seen, where all the people would be at, towards Jerusalem, towards the city. And he gets down on his knees and he prays. So here's my point to you. Here's the point. And I see some note takers up here. If you're not a note taker, I want you to get out your phones for a second. Because I want everybody to write this down. And this is not some prophetic thing, but I think this will matter. And this is going to be the sentence that I want all of us to live our lives by this week. Here's why I think Daniel kept the windows open. Some of our peers and some of our co-workers, some of the people we do life with, will never, ever read the Bible. They just won't. There's some people you know that will never pick up the scriptures. But the only Bible that they might ever read is yours. You might be, and this is where you can write it down, you might be the only Bible somebody ever reads. How you live your life might be the only thing or the only Bible that somebody reads. Well, Alex, why is that important? Because God can use you to change somebody's life without ever picking up the Bible. It doesn't mean that you're more important than the Bible. It doesn't mean you're greater than the Bible. It doesn't even mean you're greater than God. What it means is that God loves us enough that He's willing to use people like us and people like Daniel, who are just average guys who are just living for God, to change people's life. Daniel goes to the window and he gets down on his knees for everybody to see, because he knows that people can have their life changed by them seeing him worship his God. Once again, this story would be over. It would be done if Daniel would have shut the windows and had his time with God. But Daniel's relationship with God was so important to him that he didn't care who saw him. He didn't care about a new law. He didn't care about a new decree. He knew that he could change people's lives because of the God that lived in him. All he had to do was remain faithful. It says he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber opened toward Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He stayed to his routine. Guys, I'm just letting you know, I'm being honest with you. I'm being open and transparent. If this is your first time to Clyde, this is one of my favorite things to do, is just be transparent with you. I would not have done this. And that might shock some of you. I hope it doesn't. I'm just being real, and I don't know if any of us would have done it. I hope that some of you would have done this, but I'm just letting you know, if there's a decree that was going to kill me, I don't know if I would have left the windows open. Maybe I would have gone in and shut the windows and just had my prayer time with God, and then walked out of there like nothing happened. Daniel, and here's going to take the rest of the point. This is the rest of what we're talking about. Daniel was bold. See, this is the story of Daniel chapter 6, is he was bold in his faith. Boldness. So tonight, are you a bold Christian? Not just are you a Christian, not just do you have the description of being a believer in Christ, but do you have the description of being a bold Christian? That in the face of adversity, like we talked about last week with Job, that you trust God, that you have faith in God, that you run to God. In the face of adversity, where they're making a law that you're going to die for your faith, do you run to the problem? Do you run towards it? Do you run to God and trust God that He'll take care of you? Daniel trusted God to take care of him. God's in control. Because once again, the big umbrella of this whole center is Daniel knew that God was the great I am. Daniel knew that King Darius had nothing against God. That God was greater than the king. And just as a new flash for some of you, that's the God we worship. Whatever thing you're going through in your life, God's bigger than that thing. The God we serve is bigger than whatever you have to face in life. These men came by agreement, verse 11, and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. How did they find him? They saw him. And so they went and got it. Verse 12. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Basically quoting what we saw back 3 verses ago. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, once again, Daniel has this amazing relationship with the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judea, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Basically, he went back and did what he did every day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed. If you didn't look at that. The king was much distressed, meaning that the king loved Daniel. Why did the king love Daniel? Daniel was a man after God. And he set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Meaning he thought about it for a while. Before he sent Daniel to the lion's den, the king sat there and figured out a way to save Daniel. He tried to figure out a way that this didn't have to be the case. He labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, now, O king, that is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, having to do what he had to do, that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. So once again, we have this picture of Daniel being removed from his house and thrown to his death. Now, once again, let's pause here just for a second to paint the context of what's going on. Daniel has faith in God. He does. He absolutely has faith in God. We've seen that. That's been evident in the text. But what Daniel did not know is that his life would be saved by God. He didn't know that. Just like 3 weeks ago when we looked at Abraham and Isaac. Abraham had faith with God that he would sacrifice his son Isaac. He did not know that God was going to provide a lamb. Or a ram, excuse me, not a lamb, a ram. That Abraham was doing what God called him to do. And so here's my point to you. We have to be willing to live in boldness in our faith, whether or not we know if God's going to show up and save us. We know God loves us. We know God cares about us. We know that He's in control. But God could have simply chosen to let this be Daniel's death. That God had done enough, or that Daniel had done enough. This could have been the end of the story. Daniel did not know when he was going to the lion's den that he'd be killed. And so you need to understand that you can't just say, well, I don't know if God is going to save me from whatever adversity you're going through, so I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not going to answer that calling. I'm just not going to go through that battle. I'm not going to go through those flames. I'm not going to go through those hardships. I'm going to turn my back on God and go the other way because I don't know if it's going to work out in my benefit in the end. Here's my point to you. It doesn't matter if it works out in your benefit. It matters if it works out in His benefit. See, Daniel was willing to die for God because he knew it would be glory to God, not to himself. That's how strong Daniel's faith was he was willing to die for his Messiah, for his God, for his Yahweh. But what we see is that God wasn't through with Daniel yet. It says, the king declared, Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually. The only reason I highlighted there is because it talks again about the faith of Daniel. That even the king knew that Daniel worshiped God continually. Do you worship God continually? Is that a description of your life? May the God whom you serve continually deliver you. So kings root for God, root for Daniel. And a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So Daniel's in this den with the stone covering the entrance with lions. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Meaning the king was distraught by his friend Daniel being in the den. Then at break of day, the king arose and went to haste to the den of lions. Notice that part. The king arose at the break of day. The king wanted to see. The king was distraught. I mean, once again, the king didn't want to do this, but he had to because he made the law. Once again, the connection of Daniel's relationship with the king. Here's my favorite part of the whole part, the next couple of verses. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, once again look at the description, servant of the living God? Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lion's den, or from the lions? Then Daniel responded to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth. They have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. As the story goes, Daniel's faith saved his life. Because Daniel was bold in his relationship for God, God honored him. God cared for him. God loved him. God sought him. And sent an angel to shut the mouths of lions and save Daniel's life. Because of his boldness. Once again, I want you to get that thing, because are you bold? Are you bold? Are you bold for God? Do you trust God enough that he'll take care of you? Do you have faith enough in God that he's in control? Do you have faith in God that when you are faced with whatever your lions are, that he'll shut the mouths of them and you'll overcome it? See, because we all have lions in our life. We all have moments where we have to face things. For some of you, it's your home life. Some of you, your parents are divorced. The home is just a mess. You hate going to your house. You hate being there because it's just not happy. So that's your lion. That's the thing that you have to face. That's the place that you go where you feel like you've been thrown in. And for some of you, it's the relationship you're in. You feel like you're in this beat down relationship where you just, one of you wants one thing, the other wants the other. You're always continually fighting all the time. And that's just the lion you're facing. For some of you, it's school. You're just bad at school. You hate school. But you know you need school. You all need school. And so you just struggle with it. For some of you, it's your sin in your life. Let's be real honest. For some of the guys in this room, it's sexual immorality. It's sexual impurity. It's looking at things you shouldn't be looking at. It's the lion that you have to face. Ladies, for you, for some of you in this room, it's your self-worth and your self-image. That's your lion, what you see in the mirror, what you look at, and that you just don't feel good enough or pretty enough or strong enough because you've listened to everybody else. And so that's the lion you face. We all have lions that we have to face on a daily basis. Daniel was looking at his lion face to face. And Daniel never wavered in his faith. He was bold. And so my challenge to you tonight is this, is that when you look your lion in the face, whatever it is, relationships, family life, school, athletics, self-worth, sin, whatever it is, drugs, alcohol, when you look in the face, you do not waver because you know you serve the great I am and that he can shut the mouth of whatever lion you have to face. It says, I was found blameless before him and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den and no kind of harm was found on him. He didn't even have a scratch because he what? Trusted in God, or in his God. Here's the last part, and we'll get through this. It says, the king commanded, and those men who had miraculously accused Daniel, or maliciously, not miraculously. That would be a whole different weird sentence there. Maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and notice this, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke their bones to pieces. Before they even hit the ground, the lions got them. It shows you how lack of faith those guys had. Verse 25, and King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. So the king is about to make the decree over everything. Notice the impact that Daniel's faith had. It says, peace multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people, meaning everything, every nation, every tribe, every English, every language, everything that this king had power over, are to tremble in fear before the God of who? Daniel, meaning our God. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall never be to the end. Daniel's boldness led to the king's life being radically changed, which then led to the decree of the whole land to trust our God because of one man being bold in his faith. Guys, for some of you, you don't feel like you can make an impact. For some of you, you do not feel like you're a strong enough Christian or a bold enough Christian. What I want to tell you with this story illustrates to you is that if you will be bold in your faith, the impact that you can have is endless. Daniel changed an entire nation because he was bold in one chapter. Because he lived for God. Instead of closing his windows, he did what he normally did. And it changed lives all over the place. Guys, you can change this community. You can change your schools. You can change your place of business or work or the people you do life with if you would just have faith in God. It says he delivers and rescues. He works. He's going to describe God. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we see that he describes God. The story ends with this nation being changed, the decree being changed, God being now the true God, being the God that is served. So I'm going to close with this. There's three things I want to look at just for a split second, and then we'll wrap up. Here's the question for you tonight. And I fit on it a little bit. What happens when we are bold in our faith? What happens tonight while you're sitting in this room and when we get to the invitation, you sit in your chair and you decide that you're going to be bold. That when you walk out those exit doors tonight, instead of going back to your old way of living or going back to your old life, or for some of you, and I'm going to be real honest for a second. I've never said this, but I think it just needs to be said because I want you to know, and I struggled with this before too, so I'm not just saying this at you. This is how I know because I've struggled with it. For some of us, we go back to our sin as soon as we get home from here. But there have been moments that you have literally left here. I've literally left here and have gone to my house, which is a 15-minute drive from here, and gone back to my old way of living. And I know probably there's some of you who have done the same thing. That you literally left Collide and 20 minutes later, you've gone back to whatever it was that you prayed about in here that you wouldn't go back to, and you went back and did it. And I'm not here to bash you, I'm not here to make you feel bad. But here's what I'm saying. What would happen if we actually made a radical change tonight where we're sitting, where all of us are sitting, that we said when we leave here tonight, we're going to be bold. And not just say it, not just tell our friends about it that, hey, Collide School tonight, I'm going to be bold for God, hold me accountable. But you actually said, I'm going to be bold. And tonight you went home, and instead of doing whatever that thing is that you normally do, you either unplugged it, you stopped listening to it, you stopped drinking it, you stopped smoking it, whatever it is, and you read my Bible's up there. You read the rest of Daniel. Like instead of just going back to the worldly things, we actually picked the Bible up and read it some more. You know you're allowed to do that, right? Like you don't just have to read the Bible here. You can read it out there. And so imagine what would happen if all of us in this room tonight left here saying, you know what, I'm going to be bold. I'm not going to just say it. I'm not just going to talk about it, but I'm actually going to walk the walk. I'm going to use that cliche. I'm going to walk it, and I'm going to live my life for Jesus and for God because He lived His life for me. And so this whole idea of what happens when we are bold in our faith, three things, and I promise I'm going to wrap up. Our boldness is honored by God. Number one, probably the most important thing I can tell you, your boldness will be honored by God. It doesn't mean, don't write this down if you're a note taker, that my life is now going to be easy because I've lived for God. That's not what that means. It means that God will honor your boldness, meaning He will walk step for step with you when you go through hard things. You are still going to have to face adversities. You're still going to have to face struggles. You're going to still have to climb over mountains. You're still going to have to do life. But if you will choose God and not choose worldly things, He will honor you, I promise, because I've seen Him do it in my own life. I've seen Him do it in Daniel's life. And knowing some of you, if you will look back to the times where you were bold for God, you've seen it Him do it already in your life before. So number one is this, our boldness is honored by God. It was with Daniel. Number two is this, our boldness can impact and change other people's lives. We looked at it, a whole nation is now serving, or at that time was now serving our true God because one man, one average Joe man who just loved God was bold in his faith. Guys, I'm going to repeat what I just said. I want you to understand you can change the community. You can change your workplace. You can change your school. Because our God's big enough to do that. You're not big enough. You're not great enough. Sorry, everybody, you're not pretty enough. But our God is. And if you will let him work in your life, you will see radical things happen. Because we serve the great I am. We serve the God who's alive. And the last one is this, and maybe this is the most important. Our boldness changes our life. See, so many of you are waiting for your life to change. So many of you are ready to be out of the funk you're in, out of the down spiral that you've been going in. You're ready to start feeling better. You know, one of the things that most of you say when I ask you how you're doing is, I'm tired. I'm worn out. I'm burnt out. I'm exhausted. I can't go any farther. Life is coming down. The sky's falling. Life sucks. Everything sucks. Everything sucks. When you begin to be bold in your faith and God becomes number one, the question gets a lot easier when I say, how are you doing? And I'm blessed. My God's in control. Man, you want to know what happened this week? God showed up and my life's been changed. I've been living for it. I feel better. I'm sleeping better at night. The anxiety I struggle with is gone, because God's in control. And so your life begins to change when you're bold for God. You shouldn't just be bold for God so your life will be better, but it's a positive thing. Your life will be changed. I'm going to ask the band to come up and we're going to get ready to close. But here's the last thing I want to point to you and I want you to think about. Daniel was a man, and I'm going to recap the story just for a second as the band set it up. Daniel was a man who did not make an error. It doesn't mean he was perfect all the time, but in the story we looked at, he was a man who was blameless. He was a man who was living for God. He was a man that the satraps and the other officials could not find fault with. So as I began to think about this story, and I waited till this point to share it, because I think it's a good transition to the invitation. As I began to think about this story, a man who was perfect, or not perfect, but a man who found no fault. A man who lived for God, who trusted God. But a man who, because of his faith in God, got thrown into a lion's den to be sacrificed by the people who he trusted. And I began to think that I've heard that story before. That that's not just the story of Daniel, but that's a story of somebody else. And as I thought about that story for a second, there was a guy in the New Testament who came and lived for God. That his whole purpose to coming to this world was to do the will of the Father. A guy who, if I've read the story right, was perfect. A guy who was not found with any blame. A guy who walked the walk. A guy who lived by faith. A guy who wanted to change people's life for the better. A guy who never failed. But that same guy was the guy who had his followers and the people around him, including the religious leaders of the day, who had been teaching about the one day of the perfect guy who was coming, but they were so blind and so jealous, kind of like the officials and satraps, that the guy that they had been talking about that was going to come was already in their presence. So that guy had his friends and his people he did life with and the religious leaders of the day at the time come up with this plan that they had to get rid of him. That they had to throw him away, that he had to be sacrificed. And so this perfect, innocent guy, kind of like the story of Daniel like we just looked at, this perfect guy in the New Testament who was perfect and without blame, got his back turned by everybody that he came into contact with, kind of like Daniel, and was thrown to his sacrifice. But the difference in the two stories is that that guy had to go through his sacrifice. That God didn't spare him from his sacrifice. See, the guy that I'm talking about is this guy named Jesus. And so Jesus goes to the cross as a perfect man, without fault, whose only purpose on earth was to live for God and to point everybody he came into contact towards God. And so he gets thrown to his crucifixion, to his lion's den, which would have been the cross. Which, let me just tell you, would have been 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times worse than the lion's den. But the difference was that Jesus had to go through it. That God said that the plan for all this was that his son had to go through the sacrifice. And so as we read the story, Jesus goes to the cross. He dies for our sins, for us, so that we can have relationship with God. And he dies. He dies. If you've never read the story, what happens next is the anthem for believers in Jesus Christ for our whole life. That he died on Friday. He was dead Friday night. He was dead all day Saturday. He was dead Saturday night. But then Sunday morning came. And the sacrifice, the death, no longer could beat him. So our Jesus rose in victory. See, this thing called Easter is happening Sunday. And wherever you go to church, wherever you decide to spend your Sunday, the point of Easter is that our God, our Jesus, went through a sacrifice because he loved you and he cared about you. But he rose 3 days later to show that death and sin and Satan could not beat him. And he rose in victory because God chose to let him do it. And the impact of that has been thousands of years later. You and I are sitting here on a Thursday night, April 18, 2019. And we're about to worship Jesus. So the picture I'm trying to paint for you as we get ready to sing this song is that because Jesus, like Daniel, was bold in his faith and was willing to do what God called him to do, thousands of years later, our lives have been changed by that. I'm not here to say that you are going to be greater than Jesus. But what I'm saying to you is that because Jesus died and rose, you and I now have the opportunity to live for him and have him work through us and change maybe hundreds, thousands of lives. Guys, this is